He is a man whose involvement in South Asia goes back to a childhood partly spent in India, and with deep involvement since the late 1970s in the struggle for civilian and democratic rule in Pakistan. He has an involvement almost equally long in Iraq, where, as a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee staff in 1988, he uncovered the Al-Anfal campaign of genocide against the Kurds and was the drafter of the Prevention of Genocide Act, which was an effort at that time to bring sanctions to bear on Saddam Hussein for those activities. He became, in 1993, the first United States ambassador to Croatia, served there for 5 years, weathered 2 wars, negotiated successfully for the territorial integrity of Croatia, and was an architect of the Dayton peace negotiations that ended the wars in Bosnia. In 2000-2001, he served as a minister in the United Nations Transitional Administration in East Timor, in which capacity, as part of a multilateral government, he normalized relations with Indonesia and negotiated the return of oil rights from Australia to East Timor. He was appointed in 2009 deputy head of the United Nations Assistance Mission for Afghanistan, and he spent about 6 months there before running into the problem of electoral fraud. Alongside the professional staff of UNAMA, he insisted on upholding the mandate that the Security Council had given that the elections in Afghanistan should be free and fair, and this position led to his being dismissed from that post. As that happened, 8 members of the professional staff of UNAMA either resigned or left in solidarity. Peter Galbraith has a distinguished record over many years of standing for democracy, for the resolution of conflicts, and for the construction of enduring peace. And so I'm really very proud, as his brother, to introduce him today. Peter, would you come up?
Thank you, dear brother, for that entirely neutral and objective introduction. You can see that in our family we do somewhat better than our fellow leftists in England, where the Miliband brothers are each running to be leader of the Labour Party. And I think one thing you will note that Jamie did not comment on, but if you followed the trajectory of my career that he described, from staff of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee to ambassador to Croatia to cabinet minister in East Timor. It's one of ever more important jobs in ever smaller places. I want to obviously talk about Afghanistan, but I want to talk about it strictly from a strategic perspective, and to ask and answer the question of whether the war is winnable. Because frankly, whether you think Afghanistan is important or not, whatever view you have of what we might be obligated to do there, morally, politically, if, in fact, there's no way to win the war, if it's unwinnable, then none of those things matter, because there is no point from a national security perspective of committing resources, valuable military resources, valuable national security resources, to a conflict that cannot be won. Now, what is the nature of our strategy in Afghanistan? It is a counterinsurgency strategy. And as every general and analyst would say, as General McChrystal says, the center of gravity in a counterinsurgency strategy is the people. Yes, you want to kill a certain number of the enemy, but that by itself does not work. You will not prevail that way. You have to win over the population. And I think everybody would agree that it is not the United States that can win over the population, although I want to say in large parts of Afghanistan, the coalition forces are not unpopular. It's quite different from Arab Iraq. But anyhow, it's not that the United States can win over the population. After all, we are foreigners. We're not going to be there forever. No country welcomes an indefinite foreign occupation. And so I think everybody would agree that in order for the counterinsurgency strategy to work, you need a credible Afghan partner. And so the question is, do we have a credible Afghan partner? And is there any, if we don't, is there any prospect that we can end up with a credible Afghan partner? And if the answers to those questions are no, then again, I think there's just should be no argument. We shouldn't be committing the kind of resources to the mission that they now have, because it isn't going to work. So first, do we have a credible Afghan partner in the government of President Hamid Karzai? Well, Hamid Karzai has been in office for 8 years. His 8-year tenure has been characterized by ineffectiveness and corruption. On the side of ineffectiveness, Hamid Karzai is known in Afghanistan, and frankly by people who follow it outside, as the mayor of Kabul. Why? Because his authority doesn't extend significantly beyond the capital city of Afghanistan. In Washington and in the United States, we tend to talk about these countries, Iraq, Afghanistan, as if they were homogeneous entities. There's something called an Iraqi people, there's something called an Afghan people, but that's not actually the reality. We used to talk about Yugoslavia, Yugoslavs, Soviets. There isn't Afghanistan, while it is a state, and there isn't significant separatism in Afghanistan, it is a very heterogeneous place. And in the central highlands and the north, the population is Hazara and Tajik. The Hazaras are Shiite, and the Taliban consider the Shiite to be apostate. So there's no support among the Taliban among the Hazaras, and virtually none among the Tajiks. But there's also no willingness there, particularly among the Tajiks, to accept the authority of Hamid Karzai. So although Afghanistan's constitution is very centralized, in fact, the authority of the central government does not extend significantly to the north of Afghanistan. And in the south of Afghanistan, in the east, the Taliban control the countryside. They control much of the city of Kandahar, Afghanistan's second largest city. And in Jalalabad, it's not Karzai who runs the show, but the local power broker, if you will, the governor, Sherzai. So in that sense, the description of Karzai as the mayor of Kabul, as an ineffective leader who doesn't exercise authority over the country is right. And then the second issue is corruption. Afghanistan ranks 179 out of 180 on Transparency International's index of perception of corruption, just ahead of Somalia, which has no government at all. So if you have that kind of record, 8 years of ineffectiveness and corruption, I ask you, what makes anybody think that the next 5 years are going to be any different? There is, I mean, this goes beyond Samuel Johnson's saying of a second marriage being the triumph of hope over experience. A third term for Karzai goes beyond that. But there's another factor. There's another factor which makes reform even more improbable, and that is the manner in which he secured his second term, this new term, which was the result of a massively fraudulent election, as I think now everybody recognizes. On August 20th, 6 million votes were recorded in the Afghanistan presidential elections, or reported, I should say. About 3 million for Karzai, 3 million for the other 40 candidates. But of the Karzai votes, at least 1 million, probably as many as 1.5 million, were never actually cast by real people. In fact, they weren't, for the most part, stuffed ballots. They were simply reported from polling centers that never actually existed. This was the part of my quarrel with the United Nations, which was using your taxpayer money, about $200 million, to pay for these elections. There were about 7,000 polling centers, and it became clear that about 1,200 of them were in places which were so insecure, either because they were controlled by the Taliban or in combat zones, that nobody from the Election Commission, nobody from the Afghan government, nobody from the security forces had ever been there. It turns out there are a couple of things that if you're going to steal election, this is basically wholesale fraud. I mean, retail fraud matters in very close elections. But that's if you have double voting or you manipulate, you reduce, so you have fewer voting machines in minority districts than you do in suburban districts. Yes, okay, that can affect the result in a close election. But this wasn't a case of something in a close election. This was a case of, as I said, wholesale fraud. And so it turns out when you're doing wholesale fraud, it's really convenient to have polling centers that don't exist. Because if they don't exist, there's no way that inconvenient things like people like candidate agents can be there to observe a vote, or local or international observers, or voters, all of whom might detect something that was amiss. And so one of the things I tried to do was to get these removed from the rolls. They weren't, and they produced a very large number of these phony votes. The end result was, it was several months of political turmoil. Eventually, there was a separate body called the Electoral Complaints Commission, which was at that time independently appointed, 3 by the UN, 1 by the Afghanistan Supreme Court, 1 by the Afghanistan Independent Human Rights Commission. There wasn't time for them to review all the phony ballots, which is what they were supposed to do. They did a statistical sample. They removed enough of them to force a runoff, whereupon the Election Commission, and which were the people who were running the fraud, committing the fraud, they put in new rules that made sure the second round would be even more fraudulent, and as a result, it wasn't held. But clearly, this whole process didn't fool very many people in Afghanistan. They understood that the election was a fraud, and they understood that Karzai was not legitimately reelected. In the North, this is his main opponent, Dr. Abdullah, who's actually here in Washington, speaking at the USIP at the same time I'm speaking here, was seen as a Tajik, although he actually was one of the few Afghans. His father was a Pashtun, his mother a Tajik, but he was seen as a Tajik. When the fraud took place, basically the Northerners said, well, we're not even going to give nominal obeisance to the central government in Kabul. And in the Pashtun areas, which is, of course, Karzai is a Pashtun in the south, the fraud simply took away any notion of, or diminished any notion of legitimacy that he might have as compared to the Taliban. So let me just come back to the question of whether we have a reliable partner and say we have a government with a track record, an 8-year track record of ineffectiveness and corruption, now in office by virtue of fraud and therefore handicapped by illegitimacy. So why would we think things would get better? And then there's a final element, which is a little sensitive here in Washington. But the fact is, and I don't know how to put this diplomatically, so I guess I won't, Karzai's a weirdo. On the 1st of April, having denied for months that there'd been any fraud in his reelection. No, it was all legitimate. He then gave a speech and said, yes, it was massively fraudulent. But Afghans didn't do it. The UN did it. Galbraith did it. I have to tell you, I was in Rome. To me, I thought politically it was a bit odd, after all, although there'd been quite a splash around my being fired, and I'd written a bunch of op-eds. In the nature of this business, you get forgotten. I was living happily in Vermont, which is a good place to get forgotten, I think. So he revived it. Naturally, everybody was tracking me down. My first reaction was, as I told the BBC, that I thought this must be an April Fool's joke. But then I realized I didn't have that kind of warm and fuzzy relationship with Karzai that he'd want to do that to me. Of course, I had to issue a denial, beyond the fact that I had no real capability to produce 1.5 million phony votes. I had to say, if I was going to steal an election in Afghanistan, it wouldn't have been for Hamid Karzai. But it was a strange outburst, which was then followed by, I mean, you might excuse one strange outburst, but this was then followed the next day by a phone call to Secretary Clinton in which he apologized, and the day after, a speech to the Parliament in which he announced that he might go join the Taliban. Now, that, again, is not necessarily a very good thing to say when you have about to have 100,000 American troops on the ground fighting to preserve your government against the Taliban. And you have to say, I mean, you really do feel, we have 1,200 Vermont National Guardsmen in Afghanistan. So I talked to all over the state. And people are very concerned. And what is the message? When you're there, you have people risking their lives, being separated from their families, and the head of the country that you're there on the ground fighting for announces he might go and join the enemy. But it's also just weird. And then the next day, he announced that, well, in addition to the UN, the US had committed the fraud that had gotten him reelected. So I hope I persuaded you that Hamid Karzai, corrupt, ineffective, illegitimate, and weird, is not a credible partner. And again, I hope I've persuaded you that a credible Afghan partner is an essential part of this process. Now, the question is there some way to get to having a credible local partner? And I think my answer to that is, at this point, no. Had Karzai been legitimately reelected in 2009, and incidentally, it's not clear that he would have been reelected. And this is the conventional wisdom in Washington is, oh, it didn't matter. But in fact, if you analyze the results a little more carefully, it's not at all clear that he would have been reelected. But let's suppose he had been reelected. Well, then there might have been, at least you would have taken away the stain of illegitimacy. There still would have been problems. But now the question is, how do you get to a legitimate government that is capable of reform? Well, first, the U.S. is investing, as part of the civilian surge, hundreds of millions of dollars in activities in civilian activities aimed at reform, but including rule of law and anti-corruption. I can assure you that these things will only operate entirely at the margins. If there's going to be prosecution of people for corruption, it will be prosecution of people who are being prosecuted not for corruption, but because they're politically out. Or, as was the case with the recent mayor of Kabul, you have a prosecution, he's convicted, he's let out of jail, and he's reappointed to some other position. I mean, this is the behavior. So it's not a serious effort. It's basically a sham. But even if it was, it would not really root out the problem, even if it was more serious than it is. There is a case to be made for a different system of government in Afghanistan. Afghanistan has one of the most centralized political systems in the world for a country that is one of the most diverse geographically and ethnically, and it doesn't work. It is centralized in two ways. First, everybody in Afghanistan who works in government works for the central government. There is no meaningful local government. So if you're a teacher, you work for the Ministry of Education reporting up to Kabul. And it is centralized in the sense that there's a very weak parliament and a very powerful president constitutionally. But of course, in reality, that's not what happens. As I said, Karzai's authority doesn't extend much beyond the capital city. And so in the contest between president and parliament, yes, he tends to win that contest, but it's a contest between two institutions that do not exercise real authority. A different kind of constitutional system in Afghanistan might produce a better result. That is to say, one in which, well, to be honest, an Iraqi-style constitution, one in which you have a prime minister and cabinet chosen by the parliament in a manner, with supermajorities required, in a manner in which all the ethnic and political factions in Afghanistan are then represented in the cabinet. This is what happens in Iraq. Yes, things don't get done, but everybody's bargaining within the cabinet. And second, a system of elected local government with budget and legislative authority so that what happens actually on the ground is more formalized. But we're not going to, first, we're not pushing, we're not proposing this kind of constitutional change. It is totally resisted by Karzai and many of the Pashtuns. We instead are embarked on a strategy aimed at strengthening the central government. So I see there is no credible partner, and I see no prospect for having a credible local partner. And let me just illustrate how this works on the ground. If you, again, follow what the military says about the strategy, it involves U.S. troops go into an area, they clear the Taliban out of the area, and let's pause right there. Do they actually succeed in clearing the Taliban out of the area? It's not as if they're killed or driven away. In fact, they don't even take off their uniforms and go home because they don't wear uniforms. They simply go home. And then what happens? In order for the strategy to work on the ground, you need to have an Afghan army that can come in and provide security. You need an Afghan police that can provide law and order, and you need an Afghan government that can provide honest administration and win the loyalty of the population. Now, the only piece that is where there's some progress is the Afghan army, although it cannot operate on its own. The police is a disaster. Tens of billions of dollars have been spent on training an Afghan police force with very little to show for it. And this case gives an insight into some of the problems in the country. Because of the need to build up an Afghan police force quickly, the police have had an 8-week training course. I'm told it's now been reduced to 6 weeks. Well, 80% of the recruits are illiterate. Many of them are on drugs. There's a piece in the New York Times about that today. There are also many of them come from villages where, shall we say, they are not equipped with the basics of even hygiene that come from large numbers of men living together in barracks. So in that 8 or 6 week course, there's a lot of stuff that's really deals with some very basic material, not a lot with policing. And then, in the south of Afghanistan, 1 out of every 10 policemen gets killed each year. And so another part of this training course involves simple survival skills, how to position yourself at a checkpoint so you don't get shot. That doesn't leave a lot of time to produce a policeman. Now, it is possible that we could have, instead of the 6 or 8 week course, we could have a year or 2 course, more like what a Western police academy might have. The trouble with that is, and then we might even teach some of these people to read and write some of the basics. Trouble is, at the end of it, they wouldn't want to be a policeman. After all, who wants to take a job where you have a 1 in 10 chance of getting killed each year, especially if you had some other alternative? So the police piece does not work, and there's not much prospect that will work. And of course, the government piece. It's not working with a corrupt, ineffective, illegitimate government. The way in which most Afghans experience local government is abuse of power. Not necessarily that the government abuses power, but that the local power brokers, some places they're called warlords. It's always I always feel uncomfortable about that term. So power broker is more neutral, but that the local power broker is really controls things, and people see unfairness. Just to take a typical example, in Kandahar province, the local power broker seizes an orchard that belongs to a village. Let's say the village can go to court, which would be very rare, and get an order restoring the village, restoring the orchard. It's not restored. Nothing actually happens. Now, the approach that we've taken is, well, let's get some of these corrupt officials out of office. And that's, again, because we apply a very Anglo-Saxon notion here that if you're out of office, you're out of power. That's true in Washington. That's not true in Afghanistan. And so we get people out of office, but they still exercise power. And indeed, some of the people that we have in office have no power, the most pathetic case being the governor of Kandahar, who's a very nice Canadian agricultural economist. Jamie and I are a descendant of a Canadian agricultural economist, our father. So we have great sympathy for him, but he sits in the palace. Nobody comes see him because it's kind of dangerous to have seen to go there. He has no authority, but he does have time to receive the various numbers of official delegations and the military officers and all who drop by. He serves a very nice meal. But he doesn't actually control things in Kandahar, which are either controlled by the Taliban or by Karzai's half-brother, Ahmed Wali Karzai. Well, let me come back to the proposition that if the counterinsurgency strategy will not work, and I hope I've persuaded you that in order for it to work, it needs to have a credible local partner. I hope I've persuaded you that that partner does not exist. Then it's very simple to me. Our troops should not be there engaged in that strategy. From a national security perspective, we have other challenges. We could use the troops or deploy them elsewhere. We could be focused on other issues. We even could spend money domestically, and I gather that's the subject of the next panel. But you know, okay, this is an argument I'm not just trying to appeal to liberals, but also to conservatives. Because if the money that we're spending on Afghanistan is money that we're not spending to deal with Iran or whatever your favorite target is, it's ineffective. So that's that is really the key. Now, are there things that we can accomplish in Afghanistan? And here I want to make a point. I don't see this as we're either in with 100,000 troops or we're completely out. I think there are some things we can accomplish. And what are they? Well, first, there are large parts of the country where the Taliban are not present because they're Hazara, and the Hazara Shiites, and the Taliban view them as apostates, or the Tajik areas. There are basically very few Tajiks that align themselves with the Taliban. Well, let's protect the north and the central parts of the country. Kabul has now become a city of 5 million. It's bustling. It's relatively stable. We certainly should not wish to have the situation there to deteriorate. And finally, there is a counterterrorism mission. It has to be conducted carefully. There was a question I heard about the drone missile attacks. You know, those missiles are very accurate. They go exactly where we want them to go. The problem is we don't always know who is there we're hitting. The problem is with the intelligence, not with the accuracy of the missile. So we hit where we want to hit, but we don't hit. The people we hit are not necessarily who we think they are. But yes, there is a place for a counterterrorism mission. Now, how many troops would that require? Protecting the north, which is quite capable of protecting itself, so it would be supporting the north in protection. Kabul, again, supporting the forces that are protecting Kabul. And counterterrorism, I don't know, 15,000, 20,000 troops. Anyhow, a very substantially lower amount. And what about those who say, well, we can't afford to lose the war in Afghanistan? I've argued that it cannot be won. It also cannot be lost, in the sense that if winning is defined as defeating the Taliban insurgency, we're not going to do that. But if losing is defined as a Taliban victory, that isn't going to happen either. The Taliban only came to power in 1996 in Kabul, basically on the backs of Pakistani tanks. I mean, we have enough influence with Pakistan that that mistake is not going to be repeated. Again, I argue that we should have some continuing presence in Afghanistan. We've had a huge investment. We've done we have some obligation to the Afghan people. So I don't see there's no prospect the Taliban will actually take over the country. So what is the situation going to be if we reduce the number of troops to the levels that I'm discussing? Well, frankly, not very different from what it is now. Relatively secure north and central highlands regions, Kabul, the Taliban controlling the countryside, and much of Kandahar. It's not going to change very much, except that we will have a substantially reduced commitment. The parliament is controlled by the opposition to Karzai today. It is the institution where the Tajiks and the Hazaras and the Uzbeks are significantly represented. The people who are running these elections are the Independent Election Commission. They are the people who ran the presidential elections in 2009, and they're the people who stole them. In each and every instance of fraud, and we're talking about this 1 million to 1.5 million phony ballots, it was the Independent Election Commission or its staff who produced the phony results, collaborated with those who produced the phony results, or who knew about the fraud and failed to report it. Exactly those same people are in charge of the parliamentary elections. Now, as I explained, in 2009, there was this separate body set up under Afghan law, the Electoral Complaints Commission, independently appointed, with an authority to initiate an investigation of fraudulent ballots. and as well as handling complaints that were referred to it. And Karzai, when they removed enough Karzai votes, and you may remember this, to force a runoff, and again, they didn't remove all the phony votes because they didn't have time to do an audit. They just did a statistical sample. Karzai denounced the Electoral Complaints Commission as a foreign body, although in fact it was the Afghans who by their own law, empowered the UN to appoint 3 of the 5 members. Denounced it as a foreign body and said he wouldn't accept a runoff. And this required then some pretty intense diplomacy from the Obama administration, including some very good work done by Chairman Kerry of the Foreign Relations Committee. Karzai announced that he would agree to a second round, knowing that the Election Commission would put in rules that would probably force Abdullah to not run, and that's exactly what happened. But he doesn't want that body to exist with regard to the parliamentary elections. So in February of this year, he issued a decree doing 2 things. First, giving him the power to appoint all the members of the Electoral Complaints Commission, all 5 of them. Remember, before he had appointed none. And second, stripping the Electoral Complaints Commission of its authority to initiate the review of suspect ballots, so that it could only handle complaints that were referred to it by the Provincial Complaints Commission, all of whom are appointed by Karzai. The Parliament tried to overturn that decree, in fact voted overwhelmingly or maybe even unanimously to do so in the lower house, but the upper house is appointed by Karzai, so they couldn't actually overturn the decree. The UN, I think shamefully, brokered a compromise in which the UN would suggest 2 people that Karzai would appoint to this commission, one of whom would have a veto. But of course, that's meaningless because a veto means nothing where what the commission has to do is to make a decision to throw out fraudulent ballots. Because if the decision is made not to throw out the fraudulent ballots stand. So it was truly a sham. It also didn't address the fact that the Commission's powers have basically been taken away because it can only handle cases that are referred to from the Provincial Complaints Commission. Now, why is this so important? Well, the people running the fraud are going to run the September parliamentary elections. There's no independent review, and it is going to take power away from the opposition. Don't suppose the opposition is going to take that sitting down. What is a very probable result of all of this, what is a certain result of all of this, is increased chaos in Afghanistan, and what is a very possible result is civil war between the Pashtuns and the other groups. So far, the war in Afghanistan has been basically a conflict within the 45% of the country that is Pashtun. But imagine now the government, in addition to battling the Taliban, is also battling the Northerners, the Tajiks and the Hazaras. This is a disaster. And this is not a disaster, just like the 2009 presidential elections. This isn't a problem of Afghanistan. You shouldn't be outraged because the Afghans had a phony election. You should be outraged because those phony elections made the military mission of the men and women that we have in Afghanistan much more difficult to achieve. It's costing us money. People are dying as a result of that fraud. And more people will die, Americans will die, as a result of fraudulent parliamentary elections. The military mission will become more difficult. To have our troops in the middle of a civil war is going to make things worse. So what should Congress do about this? Well, it's very simple. Afghanistan cannot hold an election unless we, the United States, pay for it. We were ripped off in 2009 when the UN failed to take steps to ensure that our money was spent on having an honest count of the ballots, we should insist as a condition, and this is an amendment that can be offered, we should insist as a condition of funding those elections that, one, the Independent Election Commission have no appointees by Karzai, that all the staff who were involved in the fraud are removed and replaced, and third, that the Electoral Complaints Commission is restored to the legal authority that it had and appointment status in 2009. Three simple conditions. The likely result of that, frankly, is that there won't be elections. But that is much better than to have elections that make the situation worse. Let me stop here. I don't think I've left you very much to be encouraged about, but I'll be happy to take any questions if there's time.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Hamidi from Voice of America. At the time when there was some tension between President Karzai and the Obama administration, one of his President Karzai's complaint was your name was mentioned, and he said that you have threatened the ECC commissioner not to announce the election result. And they said they mentioned that complaint to Senator Kerry. And also other question is what you said that there was fraud in Afghanistan election, presidential election. Qaeda confirmed that the election was legitimate. Your comment on that?
Well, first, on the issue of whether there was fraud, President Hamid Karzai has said it was fraudulent. On April 1, he said it was massively fraudulent. That is, basically said his own election was illegitimate. He then made, I have to tell you, the very improbable accusation that I committed the fraud, that I stole the election for him. But he did admit that it was fraudulent. Qaeda, yes, you're right. This was part of my disagreement with Qaeda. Qaeda said, oh, it's all fine, it's all legitimate. And then Qaeda incidentally was my boss, the Norwegian head of the mission. He then was, as the facts emerged, he was then forced to admit that he was wrong, that there was widespread fraud, and he was then fired by Ban Ki-moon, or his contract was not extended. There was an allegation that I had threatened one of the members of the Independent Election Commission, that this was made by Karzai. It was a completely stupid allegation. I think the suggestion was that I'd told him that he'd be looking at his own grave. Come on. I mean, that may be the way people talk in some places, but I can assure you that's not the way I talk. Now, I'll tell you what did happen, which is the Independent Election Commission had published procedures in which they were required to exclude obviously fraudulent ballots. Those published procedures had been on the books for 5 years. They were part of the basis for the UN funding the election. The day before the final count, the vote total, and this was in September 7th, the vote total stood at Karzai 47, Abdullah, 30-something. But there were this large number of obviously fraudulent ballots, which were, by the Commission's own rules, being excluded. They then discovered that Afghan electoral law, which apparently they hadn't looked at until that very moment, did not allow them to exclude obviously fraudulent ballots, and that they therefore couldn't follow their own published procedure, and that they were going to include those ballots. And at that point, I was in charge, because Heidi was often away on vacation or giving speeches, I did call up the chief electoral officer, and I did say to him that if you include those obviously fraudulent ballots, we could not be silent about it because you would be breaking your own rules. That was the conversation. And of course, it was a totally appropriate thing to say.
Mr. Ambassador, what would you say to the to folks who are on the other side of your argument, especially in terms of your comments about how we could reduce the military down to 15,000, 20,000 to do the missions you cited? They say, oh my goodness, you can't do that because it would hand a victory to the Taliban, because that would necessitate us coming out of basically most parts of RC South and East, where the majority of the violence and Taliban are. They say it would be handing a victory to the bad guys and whatnot, and they would crow about having defeated the Americans, and it would, you know, make terrorism rise and whatnot. How do you address that, and how would you mitigate against that?
The argument that put forward is basically the reason we have to be there. Maybe it wasn't a good idea to be there, but the reason we have to be there now is that we cannot afford to lose. Yeah, that becomes a pretty thin justification, in my view, for having 100,000 troops at a cost of $100 billion with the risk to the lives in a conflict that we cannot win. So my answer to that is that's not a good enough reason for us to stay there, because obviously if we cannot win, then we're going to be there forever so that we don't lose, as defined the way you define it. And frankly, we can't afford it. I mean, I'm not going to, I'm going to simply, I think there's a moral question here. I'm putting young men and women in a battle that can't be won. But let's leave aside that. It's just a national security argument. Are there not other things, other places in the world that are important to us? For example, if our real concern is Al-Qaeda, hey, Afghanistan's pretty low on the list these days. I mean, yes, 9/11 began there, but the top leaders are in Pakistan, there's Somalia, there's Yemen. We have 100,000 troops in Afghanistan. It means we're not addressing those places. If the concern is nukes, well, there's North Korea, there's Iran. What are we doing to address those when we have we have so much of our military resources tied up there? So that's the nub of it. And so my argument would be to anybody who made that case is, please explain to me how we can win. And then you have to come back to me and say, well, we're not engaged in a counterinsurgency strategy, therefore the center of gravity is not the population, so we don't need to worry about the low scene on the ground. So far, nobody who's on the other side has come back to say that. So the second thing they have to come back to me and say is that, well, we don't need an Afghan partner. Nobody's come back to say that. The third thing they could come back and say is, no, you're wrong. Hamid Karzai and his government is a credible partner. And frankly, I haven't heard anybody on the other side really prepared to make that argument. So, but that's what I would want to hear. If somebody wants to have a debate about whether Karzai is a credible partner, I think that really is the issue. But the evidence is so overwhelming. I much prefer my side of the argument.
Ambassador, first of all, thank you for the time that you spent in the last years in Afghanistan. Second, the question I had is, what is the role in whatever direction we take in Afghanistan in the next years of the relationship between ISAF and UNAMA? And who is the we, or what is the we if we reduce in RC South and RC East, what does the we look like in terms of military troops in the North? Who composes it, U.S. and who else? Thank you.
Well, I'm not putting forward a precise strategy. I'm simply describing in a very broad brush what I consider to be an achievable mission in Afghanistan. And so I can't say how many troops would be required, and I hadn't really thought about where they would come from. I would hope that it would continue to be a coalition. I wasn't really thinking that the U.S. would withdraw and leave those who are in the north, the Germans and others there. So I would imagine a coalition effort. One of the great tragedies of this whole situation is what has happened to UNAMA, the United Nations Assistance Mission in Afghanistan, of which I was the deputy. UNAMA has a terrific staff, actually the best people I've ever worked with. They have been in the country for years, and this compares with military rotations, year-long U.S. military rotations, year-long U.S. diplomatic rotations. Our allies have even shorter rotations. Here you have people who have been in the country for years, know all the local players, speak Dari and Pashto. There was a process underway to double the size of, well, it was doubled between 2008 and 2009. It was going to be doubled again. And then came, frankly, this extraordinary leadership from Kayati. Incidentally, the views that I expressed about the elections, they were shared by everybody in the Political Affairs Division, everybody working on it, the head of UNDP-elect. I mean, this isn't my view, because I wasn't in the country all that long, and I know something about managing, which is that when you have people who are professionals, you listen to them. Ultimately, it's your decision, but they're the experts, and the judgments I've shared with you that form the basis for what I'm saying basically are drawn on that. But you had a head of mission who, frankly, who by his own admission was a terrible manager, I mean, it couldn't actually manage a two-car motorcade, but who valued above all his personal relationship with Karzai, and frankly did not want, we had collected 80 pages of evidence on fraud within a few days after the elections. We had very clear ideas of the turnout. The way you detected the fraud was very simple. What was being reported in Kandahar was a turnout between 30% in the inner districts to 200% in the outer districts. In Paktika, Karzai got as many votes, it was a relatively small province, as in Kabul. And we knew that in fact the turnout was, basically under 10% in Kandahar. I think that was generous, 2 or 3% in Paktika. Again, we didn't, of course, one of the things Kai said to me was, well, you didn't have people there counting the number of voters. Well, it turns out to be really hard to count the voters at polling centers that don't actually exist. But we had a very clear picture of it. All of this was disregarded. And then as a result of this, this whole crisis and the events that occurred, UNAMA is being scaled way back. And that's a tragedy. Obviously, things have improved with de Mistura, but the damage has been done.
Ken Dillon, Ciencia Press. I wonder, you're aware, of course, that the opium trade is a major source of corruption in Afghanistan, and I'm wondering what recommendations you would have for dealing with that problem.
The problem, we haven't really devised very effective strategies for dealing with drugs anyplace. I think the Obama administration is absolutely right to have turned from the idea of eradication to other programs. But I don't need to say this to a group of economists, the root of the problem is that the profit margins are so huge that those who wish to produce heroin can pay any price for the raw material. So sure, we can come in and get them to grow saffron instead of opium or wheat, because instead of poppy, because we have price supports or saffron prices are higher. But all that means is that the drug traffickers can increase the producer prices they pay, because after all, even if they paid 100 times more for their opium, for their poppy, it still would be not even 1% of the total final retail price of the heroin. So it doesn't matter to them. That's the nub of the problem. The opium is fueling both the corruption and the insurgency. And here's the important point: there are links between the two. This is not. Basically, in Afghanistan, we're dealing with a mafia state, and the people in the government, or people in the government, not all of them, but people in the government are in league with the Taliban. They're playing on both sides. I don't have an answer to what to do about it. The thrust of my argument is again very simple. It is that we do not have a mission that we cannot succeed at our counterinsurgency mission. Therefore, we don't have to debate whether it would be a good idea to succeed or not. We don't have to debate how important it might be to eradicate opium, because we don't have a strategy that will work, and therefore we shouldn't be putting resources to that strategy. And if you can persuade me of something else, then I might change my views, but so far nobody has.
Thank you. Sean Tandon, I'm a journalist with AFP. I wanted to get your view on President Karzai's visit here last week. There seems to be a strategy by the administration to butter him up a little bit after some of the tensions in months past. From your perspective, is this the right thing to do, or could it be counterproductive?
Well, here's what I think happened. And again, I'm not an insider in the administration. I'm not in Washington. I'm in New England, in Vermont. But basically, Karzai, they came in, their eyes were wide open. They recognized the obvious shortcomings of Hamid Karzai. The Obama administration. Well, I mean, the key characters, obviously Vice President Biden, Special Envoy, Special Representative Richard Holbrooke. I don't think there's any great secret about that. Among others, Carl Eikenberry, the U.S. ambassador. His views are, since he's still a serving diplomat, are expressed more diplomatically than I have, and I can assure you that if I were a serving diplomat, I would be talking in a more diplomatic way too. This is the freedom that comes from not being in office. But yes, clearly, I think the administration sees things very, very clearly. These are a bunch of really smart people, and I have many of them been my friends. I have great admiration for them. And I think their getting tough with Karzai approach was the correct one. But then what happened? On the 1st of April, Karzai went weird. Robert Gibbs, the spokesman, rightly called him on it, raised the question of whether the May 12th visit would take place. He made one big mistake, and I want to emphasize it because come back to my friend from the VOA. He said that he declined to say that Karzai was an ally, but he did describe him as the democratically elected leader of Afghanistan. The truth is just the opposite. Karzai is not the democratically elected leader of Afghanistan, and I think the administration makes a huge mistake when it says that he's the democratically elected leader, because Afghans know that that's not true. On the other hand, he is an ally. He may be an unreliable ally, he may be an undesirable ally, but he is an ally. Anyhow, I think what happened is that when he went weird, the U.S. responded in a fairly tough way, and then support in public opinion polls began to plummet for the war, or if I don't know if there was polling, but you could see, because I give a lot of speeches, you could see the skepticism rising. You could see the tide turning against the war. In this country and in Europe, and I was in Europe actually when these events began, and that was a real problem, and you can understand it. I mean, what people ask is, why should my son or daughter be fighting for a leader who says he's going to join the enemy? And so then that began the rehabilitation of Karzai. But frankly, it's certainly not because they have a fine view of him, but I believe it really had to do with with domestic support in this country and support from our European allies. Thank you.